Deck the house with Easter baskets, fa la 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 la, eggs.
Bill, in honor of the Easter season,
It's when Christ was born. Or was murdered, maybe. I don't know. But we eat candy to remember.
here are some questions we've received on the resurrection.
2,000 years ago, we sent a trooper here to kill your rabbit. But Earth crucified him.
Whoa, that is not how we tell that story.
Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. And in honor of the Easter season,
When's Christmas?
December 25th.
And what's today's date?
April.
we're going to take a look at William Lane Craig's Q&A that he posted around Easter.
Bill, in honor of the Easter season, here are some questions we've received on the atonement and the resurrection at our website, and a couple from Facebook.
Facebook of all places.
Well, I'm going to skip the atonement questions. If there's no creator God who cares about sin, then there's nothing to atone for. And apparently the resurrection is supposed to affirm that part, so no need to put the cart before the horse, as they said in the times when more people interacted with horse conveyances. Now, Dr. Craig is a trained, accomplished philosopher. But when it comes to history, he and I are both merely enthusiasts.
I like history, Civil War.
This first one says, "Hello, Dr. Craig. I noticed recently that in your case for the resurrection defense, you often refer to 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8, as a very, very early formulation of the creed that Christians believe, and that actually it's this creed that holds more weight than even the dating of some of the gospel accounts, which at times is hotly debated. I was intrigued by this, particularly because I'm decently familiar with the arguments of the minimal facts approach, but I don't know that much about the facts and implications surrounding this early creed. How do we know the creed can credibly be dated to within 6 years or possibly less of Jesus' death?"
In the first place, I think it's worth pointing out that this is not a creed. When Paul hands on this tradition to the Corinthians, it's not presented with any sort of confessional formula. I think that Philip has been overly influenced by those who propound the minimal facts approach and sometimes refer to this as a creed.
I think it's hilarious that Craig is scolding question asker Philip for being overly influenced by those who propound the minimal facts approach. It's been interesting to watch the reputation of minimal facts disintegrate over the past several years. Maybe I've had a small part in that. But more ironically, current Christian apologists put William Lane Craig into the very minimalist camp that he so adamantly rejects.
This basic approach is utilized by resurrection apologists such as William Lane Craig, Gary Habermas, and Michael Licona. I realize that Craig has rejected the minimalist label elsewhere, but as I will be using the term throughout this video, Craig definitely qualifies.
I'm not an advocate of trying to force someone to adopt a label, but Craig's approach in his books The Sun Rises and Reasonable Faith rings remarkably similar to Habermas's. He writes, "Any historical argument for Jesus' resurrection will have two steps, even if these are not clearly delineated. One, to establish the facts which will serve as historical evidence, and two, to argue that the hypothesis of Jesus' resurrection is the best or most probable explanation of those facts. And a few pages later, the case for the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus seems to me to rest on the evidence for three great, independently established facts: the empty tomb, the resurrection appearances, and the origin of the Christian faith. If these three facts can be established, and no plausible natural explanation can account for them as well as the resurrection hypothesis, then one is justified in inferring Jesus' resurrection as the most plausible explanation of the data. While which facts and the number of facts being considered is different, Habermas and Craig are doing the largely same thing here. I actually think that Habermas's is more effective because it avoids gospel reliability debate. As will come up, Craig draws on the Gospels to support his facts. So why not just say that because the Gospels claim resurrection, therefore resurrection? But we paused it here because Craig has beef with Habermas over labeling 1 Corinthians 15 a creed.
And Paul says that he received it and then passed it on to the Corinthians when he founded that church. And this formula or tradition is filled with non-Pauline characteristics would show that Paul is not the author of this formula, but rather, just as he says, this is a prior tradition that he received and then passed on.
Whether you want to call it a prior tradition or a creed makes no difference to me. Obviously, this debate would depend entirely upon one's definition of creed.
Apollo Creed meets the Italian stallion.
Craig fears that calling it a creed risks anachronism, as it could suggest a fixed liturgical formula like the Nicene Creed developed in Christian history, rather than a flexible oral tradition or summary. Craig, and others like Joseph Fitzmyer, suggest that the material is not a fully formed ecclesiastical creed, but more likely a primitive tradition, carefully memorized and transmitted, but not necessarily with all the trappings of later creeds. This is a definition fight, and I'm rarely interested in definition fights. From my view, the important agreement is that Paul is passing on material he received from someone else, rather than claiming to be putting forth anything that he is personally attesting to. It makes no difference at all if we call it a creed.
This is Creed, and he is in charge of something,
That
right?
is correct.
Now, the most likely time that he would have received this formula would be during his visit to Jerusalem in AD 36, if not even earlier in Damascus. It would be unlikely that he would have gotten it later when he was in Antioch, because he was himself in charge of the teaching in Antioch, and therefore such a formula would have been in his own words, his own composition. So this suggests that Paul got this during his visit to Jerusalem, which was within the first 5 years after Jesus' crucifixion. So I think you can see then how incredibly early this tradition is that Paul hands on.
Having Paul receive this creed directly from someone who knew Jesus is based on nothing but the wishful thinking of apologists. If Craig contends that because it's not his first-person voice, that Paul didn't come up with this formulation personally, then we should also reject that Peter, James, or John came up with this formulation, as it's not in any of their voices either. It holds no personal details at all. That suggests it's firsthand. This may seem strange coming from a skeptic, but I think it's equally plausible that Paul learned this before his conversion. If he was pursuing or persecuting Christians, he would know the basics. I can grant this because it makes no difference to me at all how early this formulation was circulating. It could have been uttered just a month after the cross, and that has no bearing on its truth value.
Second question, he says, is what is the significance of this creed as it connects to arguments about the dating of the Gospels?
Well, it means that it's incredibly early. When you compare the 4 lines of this formula, it corresponds to the gospel passion narratives, namely the cross, the burial, the discovery of the empty tomb, and the various resurrection appearances. So this 4-line formula is like an outline of the passion narratives, including death, burial, empty tomb, and resurrection appearances. And so it shows that what Paul received and is handing on is the same tradition that you have narrated in the Gospels.
It is entirely unsurprising that later authors would stick to the general skeleton outline of the Passion narrative that was already accepted and adopted decades before the Gospel authors even began putting flesh on the bones of the story. If we're sticking to that analogy, one might as well be equally impressed with all the on-screen incarnations of Superman sticking to the general origins that before his planet was destroyed, baby Kal-El's parents sent him to Earth, where he was raised by Jonathan and Martha Kent. That the expanded lore adheres broadly to established lore is an audience expectation and rather unremarkable. Most importantly for Craig's case, he's absolutely wrong about this 1 Corinthians formation including anything at all about the empty tomb. It says that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. Not only is there no empty tomb there, there's no tomb at all. The Greek word used here for buried can mean anything from a royal mausoleum to having your bones tossed unceremoniously into a mass trench grave. It's silent on the type of disposal. Since empty tomb is one of Craig's resurrection facts he defends, this is a huge omission.
And if you further compare what Paul says to the apostolic sermons in the book of Acts, such as Acts 13, you have the same four-point outline of those apostolic sermons.
1 Corinthians was written many decades before the book of Acts, so it's not shocking that Acts would also adhere to the established skeleton outline. Then again, Acts disagrees with Paul's writings in so many ways. Maybe this agreement is a touch surprising.
And next he says, I heard you reference this as proof of some of the post-mortem appearances of Christ. Could you also please flesh out the applications of this with regards to claims that Jesus appeared to Cephas, the 12, and 500 brothers?
Mm-hmm. Paul, in the fourth line of the formula, says, then he appeared to Cephas, or Peter. And this appearance to Peter is attested, first of all, in this very early tradition that Paul received and passed on. It is attested or vouchsafed by Paul himself, who spent 2 weeks with Peter during his visit to Jerusalem in AD 36.
The times when Paul met Peter were characterized by conflicts over money, doctrine, theology, and ethnic acceptance. While it's not unreasonable to think that Peter and Paul had a conversation about resurrection, that's not what is characterized in Galatians. The right hand of fellowship mentioned seems to be the end result of a tension-filled peace summit, where Paul insists he didn't learn anything from these men. Imagining what else they discussed is more wishful thinking than evidence.
And it is also referred to in another bit of tradition in Luke 24:34. When the Emmaus disciples return to Jerusalem, they meet the 12 gathered in the upper room, and before a word comes out of their mouth, the 12 say to them, the Lord is risen indeed and has appeared to Simon.
Those familiar with this channel will know that I advocate for the minimal witnesses hypothesis for the origins of Christianity, which posits that the actual facts of Christian history are fully explained with only two individuals, Peter and Paul, having had personal experiences of risen Jesus. One complaint that apologists often put forth to this is that they are dubious that anyone who knew Jesus would come to believe that Jesus was risen based solely on the testimony of Peter. And yet, here Craig has brought up Luke 24:34. There they found the 11 and those with them assembled together and saying, "It is true, the Lord has risen and appeared to Simon." According to this account, all 10 of the remaining disciples, the 12 minus Judas and Simon Peter, came to believe without yet having had a personal experience. They believed on Peter's testimony alone. Seems very consistent with minimal witnesses.
Now, as for the appearance to the 12 disciples, this is the best attested resurrection appearance of Jesus. It is first of all attested here in the early formula handed on by Paul. It's vouchsafed by Paul himself, who visited with Peter and James in his visit to Jerusalem in AD 36. And then we have independent narratives of this appearance in both the Gospel of Luke and in the Gospel of John. So this is a multiply attested appearance, which is again found in some of the earliest material in the New Testament.
Craig's assertion that we have independent narratives of this appearance fundamentally mischaracterizes the textual evidence. The Gospel accounts don't describe a single event witnessed by multiple sources. They present contradictory stories that cannot be reconciled without significant interpretive manipulation. Luke 24 places Jesus with an unspecified group of disciples in Jerusalem, where he eats fish and demonstrates his physical reality. John 20:21, however, describes entirely different encounters. First with the 10 disciples, Thomas absent, then with 11, set against different theological themes and including a Galilean appearance. These narratives diverge on every crucial detail: location, participants, specific actions, and underlying message. Rather than multiple perspectives on one historical moment, we're seeing gospel writers construct distinct episodes around a basic narrative framework. This represents thematic repetition, not historical verification. Consider reports of Bigfoot encounters across different locations. Each sighting shares common elements: Witnesses describe a large, upright, hairy humanoid in forested areas, sometimes accompanied by evidence like blurry photos or footprints. Yet the specifics vary dramatically. Size estimates, behavioral patterns, environmental details, and accompanying phenomena such as unusual odors or sounds. While these similarities might suggest an underlying cultural phenomenon, a sighting in the Pacific Northwest doesn't validate one in the Rockies because they describe separate alleged events. The shared motifs don't constitute mutual corroboration. They simply reflect consistent storytelling patterns within a tradition.
As for the appearance to the 500 brethren, this is really an enigma. We have no story of this event. There is not even a mention of this event, at least explicitly, elsewhere in the New Testament materials. And so you wonder, well, who were these people? What did this really happen?
That event we've been discussing for a long time now, the one that didn't really happen?
Well, I think one of the most interesting features of this appearance is this parenthetical comment that Paul introduces into the tradition when he says, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. This shows that Paul was personally acquainted with the people who were at this resurrection appearance of Jesus, and he was aware that some had died in the interim, but others were still about who could be questioned concerning this appearance if you wanted to ask them.
Once again, Craig's claim exceeds what the textual evidence can support. In 1 Corinthians 15:3, Paul explicitly states he is delivering what he received, indicating he's transmitting established tradition rather than conducting independent verification. His parenthetical note that most are still alive could simply reflect a tradition as it came to him, intended to bolster credibility without requiring Paul's direct investigation. Even if Paul added this comment to himself, he may have been relaying second-hand assurance from Jerusalem church leaders who told him most of them are still with us. This represents good faith transmission of received information, not personal authentication. The appeal to living witnesses follows standard ancient rhetorical practice for establishing credibility, regardless of whether the author had verified the claims independently. Even granting that Paul encountered individuals claiming membership in this group of 500, their sincerity doesn't guarantee historical accuracy. Within a dynamic religious movement shaped by oral tradition, communal memory, and heightened expectation, participants could genuinely come to believe that they had experienced events that they hadn't directly witnessed. Religious enthusiasm and collective storytelling creates environments where such identifications naturally emerge without deliberate deception. The phenomenon resembles how significantly more people claim attendance at Woodstock than the venue could actually accommodate. In early Christianity's rapid expansion, some members likely developed sincere conviction that they belonged among the 500 witnesses, while others may have made opportunistic claims to enhance their standing within the community. Both authentic misremembering and calculated embellishment operate simultaneously in passionate movements, making it impossible to treat such testimonies as reliable historical documentation of the original event.
This is the method of ancient historians of listing the witnesses to an event so that one could verify the truth of the story.
While naming witnesses was a recognized convention in ancient historiography, it was as much a rhetorical strategy as a historical safeguard. There are numerous examples in ancient literature where authors invented or embellished witnesses to give their accounts an air of credibility, particularly in religious or ideological contexts. So while Paul's reference to living witnesses in 1 Corinthians 15 may serve an apologetic purpose, it doesn't guarantee the historicity or verifiability of the claim.
Now, a very intriguing possibility concerning this event is that it could have been the mountaintop appearance in Galilee narrated by Matthew. An appearance to 500 people would have to be out of doors. And it was in Galilee where, you remember, Jesus preached to thousands of people as they gathered on the hillsides to hear him. And in Matthew's appearance story, it is not at all clear that only the 12 disciples were present. On the contrary, the angel says to the women, he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him, as he promised. So the women may have been part of this group. And Matthew says that some who were at this appearance doubted that this was really an appearance of Jesus. So it could well have been that this Matthean narrative of the appearance by Jesus in Galilee was this appearance to the 500 brethren.
This harmonization effort contradicts clear textual evidence and relies on unsupported speculation. Matthew explicitly states the 11 disciples went to Galilee, with no mention of crowds, women, or additional witnesses. When the text notes that some doubted, the grammar refers to the same group, the 11. Craig's interpretation requires reading a massive public gathering into a narrative focused exclusively on Jesus' communication to his core disciples. Paul's resurrection framework in 1 Corinthians 15 appears geographically centered around Jerusalem, showing no awareness of Galilean traditions, women witnesses, or the Great Commission narrative. Additionally, Paul places the 500 appearance between the appearances to the 12 and James, while Matthew's scene comes after the Jerusalem appearances in gospel chronology. The practical difficulties are equally problematic. If this appearance occurred in Galilee, how would Jerusalem-based Paul maintain contact with hundreds of Galilean witnesses decades later to verify they remained alive? Paul shows no evidence of deep Galilean connections. Craig's proposal represents classic harmonization, forcing together distinct resurrection traditions that evolved independently. Rather than resolving tensions, Craig's identification creates additional problems.
The final thing he asked, Bill, is could you please explain any other deep implications of the accurate dating of this creed pertaining to mere Christianity, even if we were to throw out the Gospels as unreliable sources, if they are connected?
I think Philip has been overly influenced by this minimal facts approach. It would be foolish to throw out the Gospels.
To be fair, Gary Habermas doesn't advocate for throwing out the Gospels. His minimal facts endeavor was his attempt to convince people like me, who are currently very skeptical of the Gospels. Obviously, an argument that counts on the Gospels is only convincing to someone who already agrees that the Gospels are reliable. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. There is no point in maximal data apologists spending any time discussing the resurrection. Every sentence should be spent solely on gospel reliability, and then resurrection would come along for free.
They, too, are based on incredibly early traditional material, like the pre-Markan Passion story, which included the story of the discovery of the empty tomb.
William Lane Craig and other New Testament scholars propose that the Gospel of Mark drew from an early pre-existing source for its passion narrative. This hypothetical source contained a continuous account of Jesus' final days, from his suffering and crucifixion through his burial and the discovery of the empty tomb. Rather than compiling scattered oral traditions, Mark inherited and preserved a cohesive narrative that had already been structured within the earliest Christian community. The argument centers on the distinctive characteristics of Mark's passion account compared to the rest of his gospel. The narrative flows with unusual coherence and structure, displays a more formal tone than Mark's typical colloquial style, and contains fewer of his editorial fingerprints. In Craig's view, the simplicity and preservation of potentially embarrassing details suggest Mark was transmitting earlier material rather than creating it. However, many prominent scholars reject this hypothesis on compelling grounds. Critics like Bart Ehrman and Thomas Thompson argue that Mark's passion narrative is heavily shaped by Old Testament allusions, particularly Psalm 22, Isaiah 53, and other scriptural motifs, suggesting literary creation rather than historical transmission. They note that no manuscript or external evidence exists for this hypothetical source, making it entirely speculative. Scholars such as Robin Faith Walsh and Burton Mack contend that Mark functioned as a creative literary author composing theological biography, not merely as a compiler of earlier traditions. Additionally, the significant variations among the passion narratives in Matthew, Luke, and John raise questions about whether they derive from a common fixed source, while Paul's early writings show no knowledge of a detailed passion narrative despite his proximity to the events.
So let's not have any sort of artificial divisions here. We have here the coalescence, like a network of extremely early and independent attestation to the facts of Jesus' death, burial, empty tomb, and resurrection appearances, which makes for a very powerful case for the facticity of these events.
The Gospels are not independent attestation of any of these things. For death, burial, and empty tomb, Matthew, Luke, and John all draw upon Mark as a source, making them not independent. As for the smattering of resurrection appearances, none of those are duplicated in any of the Gospels, making them not corroborated nor independently attested.
And I should say, Kevin, a case that has persuaded the vast majority of New Testament critics who've written on this subject.
This is unremarkable. The vast majority of New Testament critics who've written on the subject are believers. Many work at institutions that require them to sign a statement of faith that the Gospels are inerrant as a condition of their employment. In fact, William Lane Craig works at Houston Christian University and Talbot School of Theology, both of which require him to sign a statement of faith. What would be interesting is if non-Christian scholars agreed with Craig's facts, but he never presents any.
Thank you, Philip, for that question. Here's the next one. No objection I've come across has significantly dissuaded me or led me to doubt the historicity of such a well-established fact as the resurrection. However, there is one objection that I find particularly thought-provoking. It targets the popular apologetical argument from women at the empty tomb. According to this argument, if the gospel authors were inventing an empty tomb story, they would never have portrayed women as the chief discoverers and witnesses of the empty tomb. This is because women had a very low social status in ancient Jewish culture, and their testimony was considered near worthless. Therefore, because the gospel authors did portray women as such, we have reason to believe that women really did find the empty tomb. In response to this, some skeptics note that it was custom in ancient Jewish culture for women to anoint the bodies of the buried with spices. This was probably to honor the deceased and to alleviate the odor of decaying corpses. So if people were inventing an empty tomb story, the natural thing to do would be to say that women, the ones who would already be at the tomb for innocent reasons, discovered the empty tomb, and this is exactly what the gospel authors did. In Mark, Luke, he cites, it would have been suspicious and questionable to assert that men were the discoverers of the empty tomb. What is your response? That's from Nahoa in the U.S.
I wonder if this is Nahoa, the young man with an apologetics channel here on YouTube, who gives very thoughtful interviews with a broad spectrum of New Testament scholars, from the most credulous to the quite skeptical.
To clarify, you don't think the gospel authors were necessarily within the Christian movement. Plausibly, they were post-70 CE authors who tried their hand at a creative piece of writing motivated by what you could call imperial curiosity. These people were trained writers, but in light of their constant implicit and explicit references to Jewish scriptures, as well as their own stories that purport to portray the life of Jesus, I'm curious if you'd also say the gospel authors were trained theologians and historiographers.
Yeah, so that's a really good description of kind of what I was trying to get at.
In the first place, this is not merely a popular apologetical argument. If there is one consideration that has convinced the majority of New Testament critics of every stripe of the historicity of the discovery of the empty tomb, it is this fact that it is women who are the chief witnesses to the fact of the empty tomb rather than men. Any reason that one might have for using women in the story would be better served by having male witnesses.
I'll throw this back to a recent Bart Ehrman appearance. He does espouse that whole criterion of embarrassment for the women discovering the tomb.
Oh, yeah, but that's problematic because, the first time you have an account of the women discovering the tomb, people come up with this idea that, who would invent the idea that women would find the tomb? Who would come up with such a crazy idea because women were not reliable witnesses? I've actually written about this and explained why, in fact, it's completely credible that you'd have accounts of women discovering the tomb. For one thing, who would possibly believe a woman? Well, maybe other women, for example. And we have roughly 29 trillion examples of women convincing their husbands about religion, and so there is that. But moreover, the place that we find this is in the Gospel of Mark. Mark has the women discover the tomb, and one of Mark's major literary motifs is that the disciples never can understand Jesus. This runs out through the entire gospel. Jesus keeps asking, why don't you understand? Don't you understand yet? Don't you remember the loaves? Why don't you remember? Why don't you know this? And in the gospel, Jesus tries to silence people when they understand who he is. He tells them, don't tell anybody. And so he heals somebody. Don't tell anybody. Demons are cast out. Don't tell anybody. The disciples see him in the transfiguration. Don't tell anybody. So all of this is about secrecy and about people not understanding. And so in Mark's gospel, nobody understands who Jesus is. His townspeople can't figure out where he got all this wisdom. The Jewish leaders think he's possessed by the devil. His own family thinks he's gone crazy. You just go down the list. Nobody understands who he is. And so at the very end, the women go to the tomb. They learn he's been raised from the dead, and they don't tell anybody. Nobody figures out who he is. This is the theme of Mark's gospel. So why would Mark make up women going to the tomb? Because it fits his theme. So it just isn't right to say nobody would invent this. Well, yes, in fact, people would invent it. Why not?
What Mark couldn't do with male witnesses was continue his theme of subverting expectations. Sorry, Bill.
Now, in fact, to my understanding, there is no evidence at all from the first century that anointing of corpses was done only by women. This could be done by anyone. So this is just based on a false assumption.
My research supports this conclusion. Mishnah Semaho 12:6 permitted women to prepare bodies of either sex, while men could not prepare women's bodies. Although no explicit prohibition existed for men preparing male bodies, the intimate nature of washing, anointing, and applying spices traditionally fell within women's domestic responsibilities. Archaeological evidence from ossuary inscriptions and Jewish burial caves reveals gender-segregated practices and family tomb arrangements, reinforcing women's primary role in burial preparation. This pattern mirrors broader Greco-Roman customs, where women dominated mourning rituals and body preparation, cultural influences that extended to Jewish communities. While men could technically perform anointing duties, an invented empty tomb narrative would gain credibility by featuring women in this role. Imagine a film set in the 1970s. Though male nurses existed, female nurses would feel more authentic to audiences familiar with that era's gender norms. This storytelling technique, grounding fictional events in recognizable realistic details, is known in screenwriting as verisimilitude.
But notice, suppose it were true that anointing of the dead was done only by women. Well, then a different argument for the empty tomb would present itself, namely the verisimilitude of the account.
Exactly.
It would be giving an accurate portrayal of first century burial practices, and therefore this would actually redound to the credibility of the story.
Or it would be an example of someone trying to pass off an incredible story by surrounding it with realistic sounding details. That's why no number of mundane corroborations like town names will ever elevate supernatural claims to become the most likely scenario.
Next question. Hi, Dr. Craig. It was put to me by a Muslim neighbor that Joseph of Arimathea would not have asked for Jesus' body because he would get into serious trouble. Why would the authorities give Joseph the body of Jesus and not kill him as well? Thanks for any help. That's Donald in the UK.
I think the reason is because Joseph was a Sanhedrist. That is to say, he was part of the Jewish Supreme Court that had condemned Jesus and delivered him over to the Romans to be executed.
While I doubt the historicity of Joseph of Arimathea, his first appearance in the Gospel of Mark does characterize him as a prominent member of the council, that is, the Sanhedrin. There is evidence that Pilate particularly enjoyed antagonizing his Jewish subjects and indiscriminately killing dissenters and bystanders. However, the emperor did intervene against Pilate and later called him to Rome to answer for some murders. So it does seem unlikely that Pilate would want to deal with the administrative headache of executing a council member just for asking for an already dead body. Or not. Tough to say.
And Pilate was anxious to maintain good relations with the temple authorities and the Sanhedrin. In fact, there are a number of New Testament scholars who think that in begging for the corpse of Jesus and giving it a proper burial, that Joseph may actually have been acting as an emissary of the Sanhedrin, that he was delegated this responsibility from them because it was important for Jews that the bodies be taken down from the cross and given proper burial before nightfall. Otherwise, the land would be contaminated.
This is where Bill isn't fully thinking through his position. Rome was crucifying people all the time, by the dozens and hundreds. I think the evidence is weak to inconclusive that Rome was granting any kind of blanket exception to the entire province, that instead of their regular practice of leaving criminals hanging on the cross for days, for humiliation as part of the punishment, that all crucifixion victims would be allowed to be removed by sundown every single time, particularly on cases of treason. But sure, let's say for the sake of argument that Rome granted that. Do you think it would make any sense from a logistical standpoint that a leader of the council would have to personally bother the governor for each and every victim every night, each time merely for the reason of maintaining purity of the land? There were allegedly 2 thieves crucified with Jesus. Were there also emissaries from the Sanhedrin for each of those? Or was Joseph asking with a list for everyone? There's no way some less intrusive process wouldn't have already been in place. And if it happened every time, why would there need to be begging? This makes no sense.
So in virtue of his official position, it's not at all improbable that Pilate would have honored this request, especially if, as the Gospels say, Pilate was convinced of Jesus' innocence.
If Craig wants to appeal to land purity reasons, he can't consider this to be a special one-time request that needed a council leader and the governor to be involved. And if it is a special request, then you do need someone with the ear of the governor to be involved. So you might need to invent someone, since Jesus didn't hang out with influential people. How very strange that Mark 14:63 makes it clear that the entire council condemned him as worthy of death. But later that night, this council member conveniently changed his mind to believe Jesus to be innocent. Look, the gospel story isn't impossible, but it's certainly far from what would usually happen. And the details seem quite ad hoc, invented to answer why what usually would happen wouldn't work for this whole empty tomb idea.
Next question. Dr. Craig, in your book, The Sun Rises, when I read the chapter on the appearances of Jesus, I noticed that you only mentioned the wide scholarly consensus regarding the appearance to Peter.
Again, support for the minimal witnesses hypothesis that Peter alone had the experience he attributed to risen Jesus, and the other early converts were based solely on his testimony.
As such, I take that as an indicator that your case specifically doesn't depend crucially on wide scholarly agreement, at least on this point. Is that correct, or have I misunderstood? Thank you, and I hope to hear your thoughts on this. Samuel, United States.
Well, Samuel is absolutely correct that the evidence doesn't depend on the consensus of scholarly opinion. The evidence stands on its own, whatever anybody thinks.
This is one difference between Craig and Habermas. Habermas makes scholarly consensus part of his criteria, even though he never actually does the work of doing a scholarly headcount to back up his consensus claims.
Rather, the appeal to scholarly consensus is merely evidence that others also find these arguments convincing. So I'll present, say, 5 or 6 arguments in support of the historicity of the empty tomb or in support of resurrection appearances, and then I'll point out that these are not simply the conclusions of some biblical fundamentalist or radical conservative, but rather these represent the viewpoint of the wide majority of New Testament scholars, liberal and conservative alike.
The empty tomb is a bad example because it has relatively little support among liberal New Testament scholars, and even less support when you move to non-Christian historians.
So the consensus of scholarship is not offered as evidence of the facts in question. Rather, it's offered as evidence that these arguments really are convincing to those who will look at them with an open mind.
With the open mind of someone whose job is predicated on signing a statement of faith document, affirming that they'll never publish anything that casts doubt on the inerrancy of Scripture? That kind of open mind?
Dear Dr. Craig, one of the most popular claims made by Christian apologists is that Jesus appeared to more than 500 people after his resurrection. This is based on a passage from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. At first glance, this seems like compelling evidence. After all, if a court case had 500 eyewitnesses on one side, wouldn't that guarantee a verdict in their favor? However, Paul is the only source for this alleged mass appearance. None of these 500 witnesses left any written testimony, nor are they named anywhere in historical records. What we have is not 500 first-hand accounts, but rather a single second-hand claim from Paul. These witnesses cannot be cross-examined or corroborated. Imagine presenting this in court. I know 500 people who saw it, but I can't tell you their names or where they live. Trust me. Any reasonable jury would dismiss this immediately. This argument then relies entirely on Paul's credibility, not on any verifiable evidence. How do you respond, Bailey?
I would ask Bailey to advert to my earlier response to Philip concerning the appearance to the 500 brethren.
These are good questions, but yeah, Craig's answer is just going to be the same as the first time someone asked about the 500. And so we've reached the end of our midsummer Easter episode.
Well, I truly thought Easter was a zero holiday.
Honestly, Mom, don't ask. The less we know about holidays, the better.
Well said, son.
Thanks for watching. And if you'd like to hear more about the minimal witnesses hypothesis for the origins of Christianity, or my critiques of the resurrection narrative in general, tap on the playlist on screen now, and I'll see you over there. Until next time, later.